Good morning and welcome to the Collaborative on Health and the Environment Alaska teleconference on green chemistry and safer alternatives to toxic flame retardant chemicals, achieving protective policies without compromising fire safety. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. And you can find more information on the following websites: www.healthandenvironment.org and www.akaction.org. PBDEs, or polybrominated diphenyl ethers, are a type of flame retardant chemical that is widely used in everyday products, including some home furniture, mattresses, and electronics. Our teleconference in January focused on the adverse health effects of PBDEs, and if you missed that call, you can listen to the recording on our website. Today we will be discussing safer, effective alternatives to PBDEs. Green chemistry is a philosophy of chemical engineering that encourages the design of products and processes that minimize the use and generation of hazardous substances. Green chemistry can help shape protective public policies, such as the Preventing Toxic Exposures Bill, or House Bill 63, which is being considered right now by the Alaska State Legislature. In fact, there's a hearing on the bill this afternoon at 3:15 p.m. in the House Labor and Commerce Committee. And we'll be hearing more about the bill and how you can support this important legislation from Samantha later in the call. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to remind you that additional resources for this call can be found on our website. Go to www.akaction.org and click on the title of this call in the top left-hand column of our homepage. There are a number of resources listed there, including a PDF of Dr. Lauren Hine's PowerPoint presentation. The call will last an hour, and except for the speakers, all participants are muted during the presentation. Now, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Lauren Hine. He's as principal for the Lauren Hine Group and a senior science advisor with Clean Production Action. Dr. Hine advises organizations to integrate green chemistry and green engineering into product and process design and development activities, eliminating toxics and the concept of waste, and moving toward economic, environmental, and community sustainability. She was previously the Director of Applied Science at Green Blue, where she directed the development of Clean Gradients, a unique web-based information platform developed in partnership with the U.S. EPA Design for the Environment program that promotes green chemistry and environmentally preferable product formulation by providing information on key human and environmental health, safety, and sustainability attributes of cleaning product chemicals. Lauren earned her doctorate in civil and environmental engineering from Duke University, and we're so pleased to have Lauren Hine here with us today to discuss green chemistry. Lauren, would you like to begin?
Yes. Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you, Pam and Samantha also. I'm very pleased to be doing a webinar today for Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and I'm even more pleased to now be technically an Alaskan because I live in Juneau. So, and I think the timing's been very good. I've been here, maybe almost a month and have already testified twice at the legislature. So I'm pleased to be. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Hopefully everybody has access to the PDF version of my PowerPoint, which should be on the AK Action website. And I'm just going to walk through that and go to the first slide and talk a little bit about some of the using safer materials in electronics, and of course that includes the idea of moving to safer flame retardants. And my work with Clean Production Action is really about trying to make this transition in a business-friendly way, because regulations, I think, are huge drivers for change. Perhaps they're the strongest driver for change. And I think those companies that are thinking ahead are really trying to get out ahead of regulations like bans on PBDEs and to what they call future-proof, to say, well, okay, if regulators are regulating chemicals like PBDEs because they're persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, then maybe we need to be using chemicals that are not persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, because every time we have to switch out a chemical from our supply chain, according to Hewlett-Packard at least, it can cost from $5 to $50 million. So that's not something they really want to be doing more than once. And so I think you can make a very strong business case that it's important to move to safer alternatives. So on slide 1, you can see the word passive, and it's about many companies have traditionally taken a very passive approach to finding safer alternatives to regulated substance. They basically say, okay, well, if it's legal and it works, is the cost reasonable, is the performance reasonable, then it's a viable alternative. They don't really worry about if it is in fact safer. They just worry about if it's legal. They don't really take any action to ensure that it's safer. Next slide. There's, at the same time as the regulations, there's a growing consumer concern about products. There's a need for safer alternatives. Tools like the Good Guide, which is a software tool, goodguide.com, I believe. It's a tool that allows you to look up individual products and to see a rating around their health, human health, environmental profile, and also the social metrics. And to the point that you could even, there's an app on the iPhone for scanning the barcode and retrieving this information. So while the information in this tool isn't perfect, it is demonstrating the ability to just scan a phone, scan a product, and learn all about the human, environmental, and social implications. The next slide. At the same time as the growing consumer concern, there's a shifting regulatory environment. Projects such as AK Action's work to create PBDE bans, in addition to work in Europe around restricted substances and electronics, and the REACH legislation are really changing the regulatory environment. So, and then the third piece is the business driver, next slide, that I mentioned before. So in addition to consumer concerns, shifting regulatory environment, the cost of multiple substitutions is a huge business driver. You don't want to have to replace substances more than once. So, but to move from a passive position to an active position means trying to stay ahead of regulatory uncertainty and thinking about, rather than generating blacklists of bad chemicals, the idea of generating white lists or green lists that would help simplify the selection. And this can be a very powerful way, because often manufacturers will say, well, what can I use? Don't tell me what I can't use. Tell me what I can use. And they desire to use benign alternatives to avoid the unintended consequences, whether they're liability or health risks. And what we've seen recently is there's a big divide between chemical manufacturers and product manufacturers. Product manufacturers have no real desire to use toxic chemicals in their products. Historically, they have had a very little information about the chemicals in the materials that they buy to make products. So that's so they haven't really known whether these products and these materials are toxic or not. So the chemical manufacturers may have a motivation to continue to sell existing chemicals, but the product manufacturers have every motivation to buy the safest chemicals available. So what they need to know is what's in their product and what's not in their product. And so that's where chemicals policy comes in terms of creating better information in the supply chain. So what are some of the obstacles for moving from passive to active? Next slide. Some of them include defining what is green. There are many tools availability and many definitions of green. Is it social? Is it toxicity? Is it the source of the feedstock, and there are many interpretations, and there are many attributes that go into defining green. And what is measured? Is it carbon? Is it life cycle assessment? Is it the hazard? Or is it the risk? In addition, next slide, we need to look at who is choosing, who are making the decisions about materials. Typically, they're procurement experts within a company or a government organization. Sometimes they're product designers, and sometimes they're engineers. And they're typically experts in price, function, and performance. Next slide. They're not experts in toxicology. So when they see a report on a chemical, they go to look up a chemical and try to understand if it's safe or not. They can be quite overwhelmed with the kind of information that is available and whether or not they can even interpret that. So there's too much information. Often it's not comparative. They don't know how to use it. They don't know which information is best to use. And it doesn't necessarily apply to their goals. They're looking for greener alternatives for certain applications. They need to understand how it fits in their company and for their application. And they want to have some confidence that they're making the right decisions. Next slide. They want to understand that they're looking at the right endpoints, at the right impacts, that they can be consistent from decision to decision, that they can determine this themselves, and that they need something that's relatively easy to use. So there's a need for harmonization and standardization as well, because if everybody's using different sets of considerations, that works great for the specifics of the products, but when it comes to things like hazard, toxicity, there really needs to be a common language. So I'm going to talk briefly about the green screen for safer chemicals. Next slide. This is a tool that was developed by Clean Production Action. Mark Rossi and I were co-authors, and it's a tool for doing comparative chemical hazard assessment. It allows you to compare chemicals and look at their hazard attributes and decide which one is inherently safer. It builds on the EPA Design for the Environment Chemical Alternatives Assessment method, which has been developed out of these partnerships. DFEs currently has they did a partnership on Penta BDE a number of years ago, and currently they're doing a partnership on alternatives to DECA BDE, and they're looking at almost 30 alternatives to DECA and evaluating each and every one for health and safety. And this is an important tool that supports things like DECA bans or PBDE bans because it demonstrates the availability or not of alternatives. So the green screen looks at 17 environmental and human health endpoints. It provides an overall chemical score. It's a decision support tool. DFE will provide information on chemicals, but they don't provide specific guidance as to which chemical is safer. That's beyond the scope of what they can do. And the green screen is compatible with risk assessment and life cycle assessment, even though it's a different approach. It allows you to make different types of decisions. So the next slide. These are the hazard endpoints that are considered in a green screen assessment. All of these hazard endpoints are considered, whether it's environmental fate, such as persistence and bioaccumulation, whether it's environmental toxicity, whether it's human health, priority effects, which are the chronic effects typically, and the non-priority effects, which are typically more dose-related effects, or whether it's physical properties, which are very relevant to workers, such as reactivity or flammability. And next slide. Each and every one of the criteria, whether it's persistence or bioaccumulation potential or carcinogenicity, has a set of criteria to rate it as a high, medium, low, or in some cases there's a very high as well. And these criteria are based on globally harmonized systems, on US EPA precedents. In most cases, there are very few areas where we had to supplement. Where there were no precedents, we would supplement, but everything is based on precedent because it's important that if companies are having to do this work in one country, you want to leverage the work they're already doing. And so these criteria use all the available data. You can use literature data, you can use models, you can use regulatory lists, you can use analogs, and basically populate these, determine whether something is high, moderate, or low, for example, persistence, using whatever you can dig up. And that's an important piece too. It doesn't limit where you can get your information, but you use a convention of demonstrating when you have a high confidence and a lower confidence. And that's a subtlety of the tool I could be happy to follow up with if anyone's interested, but I don't have time to go into it now. So how it works. Basically, it's 3 steps. The first thing you do is you assess and you classify the hazards. And that's what I was just talking about. You look at every endpoint for, say, acute aquatic toxicity. Is it high, medium, low? Persistence. Is it high, medium, low? And that involves a lot of research and some modeling, and that's kind of the hard part, is digging out the information. But because the criteria are so clear, it allows you to make those calls. Once you've made those calls, you apply the benchmarks, and that's where you get an overall score for a chemical as a benchmark 1, 2, 3, or 4, and I'll show you a little bit more. And then the third step is you use the information to make informed decisions. So I'll give it an example here. Next slide. Here is a hazard summary table for looking at a chemical, one of the alternatives to DECA, BDE, used in TV casings. And I'd like to note that in the green screen, you look at the breakdown products as if they were the chemical itself. So if you know a chemical breaks down into something else, so if it goes into the water, say it's a cleaning product, and it degrades in water to another chemical, say the nonylphenol ethoxylates degrade into nonylphenol, or if you know that there's photodegradation, say of the DECA down to the lower congeners, or even if you know that something is getting burned and generates specific chemicals, you treat those chemicals, the breakdown products, as if they were the chemical itself. And that's important too, because once these things are released, that's what happens to them. They turn into these other chemicals, and that needs to be part of the assessment. So now we have this hazard table populated for the chemical and its breakdown products. And the next step is to apply the benchmarks. And this is relatively simple. You start at the bottom, and you ask the question, is it high P plus high B plus high T? If not, you ask the next question, is it very persistent or very bioaccumulative? And then is it very persistent and toxic? And is it high human toxicity for any priority effect? If yes, then if any of those are true, then that chemical is a benchmark 1. And benchmark 1s are designed to align with the logic behind REACH. So REACH legislation in Europe calls a substance of very high concern one that is PBT, VPVB, or equivalent concern, also carcinogen, mutagen, or reproductive toxicant. So that was a pragmatic decision. The government, deciding what is more important than something else is a subjective exercise. And the fact that governments have a fair amount of consensus on the kinds of chemicals they're concerned about gives weight to the defining of benchmark 1. And it's practical and helpful to companies because they feel that if they stay away from benchmark 1s, they might be able to stay ahead of regulations too. And there's an advantage to doing that. So then, if none of those questions are true, then you go up to benchmark 2 and ask, is it a moderate B or P and T? And then you do the same thing. You ask that question for B, C, and D. And if none of those are true, you go up to benchmark 3. Same thing, ask, is it moderate P or moderate B, etc. If not, you go up to benchmark 4. And benchmark 4 has low hazard across the board, and it's rapidly biodegradable if it's an organic chemical. And that would be the ideal for an organic chemical. So the next slide. So what happens then once you have this information? once you do this, you can roll up, you can now identify chemicals based on their benchmark. So let's say you're looking at plasticizers, and you're a polymer manufacturer, and you're trying to figure out which plasticizer to put into a polymer. You can look at the whole suite of options, and you can see that some of them are benchmark 1s or reds, some of them are benchmark 2s or orange, and some of the benchmark 3s are yellow or benchmark 4s. And then you can do things like say, well, let's stay away from the benchmark 1s, or always choose the highest scoring option that has the economic and performance feasibility. It allows people without any toxicology training to make better decisions. For example, an engineer or a product designer, they don't have to be able to do a toxicological assessment. They just have to know that they should be choosing the safer alternative. This also allows people to, it allows the wider adoption of preferred materials. If the industry knows that there are safer flame retardants available and that's been verified, then that's going to drive greater adoption of those kinds of materials. You can generate whitelists. And also, it guides the new product development. So, for example, if you're that polymer manufacturer, if you have options, you may have just been using, a benchmark 1 chemical because that's what you've been using for quite a while, and you didn't realize that it was a benchmark 1 chemical because it's not regulated. It allows you to create new formulations and guide new development toward greener options. The next slide, this is the table from a report we did looking at alternatives to DECA BDE in television casings. We looked at DECA, we looked at BPA, DP, and we looked at RDP. So this was the hazard table that was generated in that report. And that report is on our website, and I put the URL for the report at the top of this slide. We applied the benchmarks to it, and what we found is that DECA was a benchmark 1 based on its degradation products. Not based on DECA itself, but based on what it degraded into. BPADP was also a benchmark 1 based on its degradation products. So just because it's not halogenated doesn't mean it's absolutely safe. It's important to look at alternatives and evaluate them. But RDP was determined to be safer. It was actually a benchmark 2, so it doesn't mean RDP was green, and I'm moving to the next slide, but it means that it was in fact safer. And that was enough to support Maine and Washington in their work to ban the PBDEs and DECA. They needed to know that there was in fact a viable, economically feasible alternative that worked and that was in fact safer. And so Washington State actually used the green screen in their evaluation of alternatives and came to the same conclusion that that RDP was in fact safer. So the next slide. The green screen got picked up by Hewlett-Packard, and they use it as they like it because it's open, transparent, and tool. The method is fully transparent. The criteria is fully transparent. Anybody can use it. And they called us up and said, would you be interested in doing a pilot with us? And we said, sure. And then we didn't hear from them and tried to contact them. And about 6 months later, they called us back and said, okay, we're finished now. We've evaluated 30-odd chemicals, and we found the method to be useful for comparing alternatives. So if you look at the next slide, their green screen 1.0 early trials, they found that it was good for discriminating between alternatives. They really liked the simple benchmarks, 1, 2, 3, and 4. As a scientist, that kind of simplification makes me uncomfortable, but was so useful in the engineering world and in the product manufacturing world that I can now understand why pragmatically is really important. So they decided that it was a useful tool. They wanted to make it basically mandatory. So the next slide, they decided to look at a specific class of chemicals and to use the green screen. So they looked at PVC power cords, and they told their manufacturers that if they want to get onto HP's approved materials list, they would need to provide a green screen assessment of the alternatives to PVC power cords. And so they had over 29 materials screened, and a number of them were approved. And so now what HP did a lot of the work themselves. So they trained their suppliers in how to do the method. The suppliers submitted assessments, and then HP staff validated those assessments to make sure they were in agreement. And so this is a very powerful policy move by a company, because basically they're saying, before we buy materials from you, we want a good understanding of the inherent hazards of every constituent in the material that we're buying. They can do it under confidentiality, or you could even do it through a third-party toxicology expert. But this is changing the rules of the game, because they're saying we don't want to just be buying things blindly anymore, because we don't want to have to find out down the road that it contains a chemical that gets regulated. We have to pull it out of our supply chain. It's a nightmare. We want to future-proof our products and stay ahead of the regulatory trajectory. So the next slide, what they're doing now, they're applying the same program to additional materials, things like adhesives, cleaning products, and they're working with us to build an infrastructure, a place where green screen assessments can be held and shared, particularly in the electronics industry. And they're working with us to see if we can't automate some of this work as well, to really drop the cost and make it more available. So the next slide is actually my last slide. I thought I'd just give a quick summary of where we are now with the green screen program. We had pulled together a technical committee and came up with recommendations for how to revise version 1. Some of the work is simply updating. There's a new version of the globally harmonized system for classification of labeling. We needed to update to that. The US EPA Design for the Environment has come out with criteria for alternatives assessment, updating to that. Wanting to make some changes to criteria for endocrine activity and neurotoxicity, neurodevelopmental toxicity. There was interest in adding another benchmark, having 5 benchmarks instead of 4. I'm not sure we're going to go down that path. It makes it really complicated. Needing to make some changes to accommodate inorganics better, and then refining the criteria for data quality and data completeness. And that work was done by the technical committee, and it was sent out for peer review around the country. A whole team from EPA helped out, some folks in Europe and NGOs and businesses. And so we're sitting on that peer review right now, waiting for the DFE to finalize their criteria as well, and working to harmonize with them as well as possible, because we think that harmonization of the hazard criteria is really important, because it makes it easier for everybody, and the benchmarks can be subjective, but the hazard criteria should be as well-founded in robust science and regulations as possible. On the development and outreach side, we're developing a validation program to support the benchmark claims. We think anybody can use the method. We're beefing up the resources, making it more accessible. but we don't want anybody making public claims about achieving a benchmark level unless they've been through a validation process. So we're working on that. We're working with UMass Lowell, and right now we're doing a pilot project looking at alternative flame retardants, non-halogenated flame retardants. We're working with a group called PINFA, which stands for Phosphorus Inorganic Nitrogen Flame Retardant Association out of Europe. They have phosphorus and other non-halogenated based flame retardants, and the University of Netherlands is doing the validation work. And one of these, it appears that one of these alternatives will actually be a 4, which I never thought I'd see, but they're clearly better than the PBDEs. And then the other thing we're working on is a software tool. A lot of people think the green screen is the software tool, but it's not. It's actually a method, and it takes a chunk of work. So to deal with the work, we've identified at least one organization that can provide green screen assessments. It's called Tox Services. They're based out of DC. And if you don't want to use the method yourself, you could pay a third party, Tox Services, to do the assessment work for you. And a number of companies have taken advantage of that because Meg Whitaker there is an excellent toxicologist and does a great job with green screen assessments. There are some other companies who are in the queue as well to become authorized to do these assessments. But we're looking to automate this. A lot of this stuff can be list-based, and I think you can make a good start by automating some of the assessment work. So we're in the middle right now of a pilot of making a software tool to help people plug in a CAS number or a number of CAS numbers for their product formulation and get immediate feedback on what information is available and what kind of benchmark score. So the automation is great for identifying the problematic chemicals. It's going to take a while to build up the databases to really identify the greener chemicals, because regulatory bodies have not typically worried about setting good criteria for green chemicals. Their job has always been to identify problematic chemicals and regulate them. So there's been work primarily by DFE to identify what are criteria for good chemicals. And so that makes my job really fun because I get to work with some of the leaders in developing greener chemicals and also who have aspirations to sort of get beyond the regulatory constraints. But at the same time, when push comes to shove, the thing that really is driving all of this forward is regulations, because many companies don't pay attention unless they have to. But once they get started, they realize that this can be a very innovative path forward, and it creates opportunities for new products, and there's a growing market for these kinds of new products. So I think it's very effective to have the bans as well as the green product drivers. So that's all I have to say. Thank you all for joining and for having me on this webinar.
Thank you, Lauren. And for those of you who have questions for Lauren, just please stay on the line. We have another speaker. We're going to learn more about what's happening in Alaska. And Lauren, thank you again. It's so wonderful to hear of real solutions, and this green screen is amazing. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Samantha Englishoe, Environmental Health and Justice Organizer for Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Samantha is Quichinathabascan, Kagwantan Tlingit, and a lifelong Anchorage resident. Samantha graduated in 2008 from Seattle University, where she majored in political science and pre-law. And after graduation, she worked as a public policy fellow in the office of Representative Beth Kurtula and as a rural affairs intern for Senator Mark Begich. Samantha came to ACAT in January of this year to work on policy and environmental justice issues. And she'll be telling us more about House Bill 63. Welcome, Samantha. Would you like to begin?
Yes. Hi, everyone. This is Samantha. Thanks for calling in, and thank you, Lauren, for being a great presenter. Today I'm going to do an overview of the Preventing Toxic Exposures legislation in Alaska. I'll give an update on the committee action the bills have had so far this session. I'll mention the type of support it's received and then explain how people can become engaged on this toxic toxics issue. As Lauren and Diana have said, PBDEs are a class of toxic flame retardant chemicals that are added to common consumer products to delay the spread of fire. These products include electronics such as TVs and furniture foams, fabrics, and kitchen appliances. PBDEs are similar in structure to the banned chemicals PCBs and dioxins and thus have similar harmful effects on the body. PBDEs are not bound to the products they're used in, and humans are exposed through contaminated air, household dust, and foods. PBDEs accumulate and are long-lasting, and we are concerned about them because they interfere with proper thyroid function in laboratory studies, cause problems with brain development, and disrupt learning, memory, and behavior. Levels in wildlife and people are increasing exponentially. Its chemical stability means they can travel long distances and come down to Earth in cold places. Alaskans are at special risk for exposure to brominated flame retardants. These chemicals have been detected in soil, air, sediments, birds, marine species, fish, and human tissues, blood, and breast milk. PBDEs in human breast milk are increasing and doubling every 2 to 5 years. I'd like to note new scientific evidence about the health effects of brominated flame retardants that compels urgent action. Over the past year, Dr. Julie Herbstman of the Columbia University Center for Children's Environmental Health found that children who had higher prenatal exposures to PBDEs scored lower on tests of mental and physical development at ages 1, 4, and 6. Also in the past year, the San Antonio Statement, a consensus statement by over 150 scientists, emphasizes that brominated flame retardant chemicals increase fire toxicity, but their benefit in improving fire safety has not been proven. Legislation to prevent products containing these chemical flame retardants from coming into Alaska was introduced by bill sponsors Senator Wielkowski and Representative Lindsey Holmes. Senate Bill 27, in its current version, would phase out the manufacture and sale of products containing penta and octa BDEs by January 1st, 2013, and it phases out the manufacture and sale of electronic products, furniture, textiles, and mattresses containing deca BDE by 2013. It also has an immediate effective date for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation to participate in a multi-state chemicals clearinghouse to build capacity to identify and promote safer chemicals and products, and also to enhance the efficiency of state initiatives on chemicals through collaboration and coordination. Alaska would be sharing resources and build knowledge with other states. House Bill 63 also has the same phase-out dates for products containing penta and octa BDEs, January 1st, 2013, and products with deca BDEs by 2013. In the current House version, it would empower the Department of Environmental Conservation to ban other products containing flame retardants if it's determined to harmful to the to public health or the environment, and if reasonable, safe alternatives exist. This bill also requires several state departments to complete a review of the risks of PBDs, possible alternatives, and the findings from other U.S. agencies. Last month, Senate Bill 27 had 2 hearings in the Senate Health and Social Services Committee where a committee substitute for the bill was introduced and passed out of that committee. It was referred to the Senate Finance Committee on March 1st, and the Senate bill has not yet been scheduled a hearing in Finance. House Bill 63 had its first hearing in the House Labor and Commerce Committee Monday of this week, and has a second hearing scheduled for this afternoon at 3:15 p.m. If passed out of this committee, its next referral would be to the House Finance Committee. We've received support from the Alaska Conservation Alliance, which is an umbrella group for approximately 40 member organizations who voted for toxic exposure phase-out to be one of their common agenda priorities for the year. The Alliance has worked on outreach efforts with their members and has followed the bill action closely. Another group to prioritize the PBDE bill is the Alaska Youth for Environmental Action, a program that trains youth leaders to impact environmental issues and hosts an annual Civics and Conservation Summit in Juneau. They chose the PBDE bill as a focus bill for this session, and right now the youth leaders are working on a presentation of the bill for their youth-led visits to state legislators on Thursday. And this includes visits to Senator Lyman Hoffman, co-chair of the Finance Committee, and Senator Donnie Olson, a member of the Finance Committee. Some of the letters of support the bill has received are from the ARC of Anchorage, an organization that serves people with developmental disabilities and mental health issues. In their letter, they emphasized early PBD exposure's effect on learning and developmental disabilities. The bill has also received letters from the Alaska Intertribal Council and the Nome Eskimo community sharing concerns about PBDEs being found in traditional foods and addressing the need to protect the health and well-being of future generations. This is a public health bill, and we've been working to encourage Alaskans to get in touch with their district senators and representatives. On the ACAT website, there's more information about the two PBDE bills as well as fact sheets about this toxic chemical. You can also sign up on the website to receive action alerts that would provide legislators contact information and talking points about PBDEs in Alaska. For the participants of this call, we urge everyone to contact your own district reps, especially fair committee members of the House Labor and Commerce Committee or the Senate Finance Committee. Thank you for caring about this legislation, and I'm going to turn the call back over to Diana.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you again, Lauren. I would now like to open the lines for questions and comments, and you'll need to wait a moment while we unmute the lines. Just one moment. Okay, I think that we have them unmuted now. So I would like, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press *6 on your telephone to unmute your personal line. And please state your name and affiliation. We also ask that you try to be brief with your comments to allow others the opportunity to speak as well. So if anyone has any questions for Lauren about the Green Screen Project, for Samantha about the current legislation, this is our time to discuss.
Hello, Diana.
Yes.
This is Pam Miller with Alaska Community Action on Toxics. I have a question for Lauren. And Lauren, thank you so much. This is incredibly helpful as we begin to understand what viable alternatives there are for DECA-BDE, and I think legislators have legitimate concerns about making sure that there are safer alternatives available and ready to replace this very persistent and bioaccumulative toxic. But I was wondering if you might say a little more about, mentioned that there was an assessment looking at 30 alternatives to DECA. Would you say a little bit more about the status of that evaluation and the screening process and what might be coming out of that and when?
Okay. Yes, that is a project of the U.S. EPA's Design for the Environment, and you can go to their website, and that's epa.gov/DFE, and then look at the partnerships, and then you can read a little bit about the DECA partnership there. And right now, what has happened is it's a broad group of participants, a number of industry folks and chemical manufacturers and NGOs and academics, including people like Heather Stapleton from Duke University, and they've come up with a list of viable alternatives to DECA. And DECA is used in a number of areas and in a number of different polymers, and so there's no one chemical to replace it for all applications. So I have a spreadsheet that I would be happy to share with you that came out of the group that shows each of the alternatives and how it's used, what kinds of applications, whether it's in electronics or textiles or hard plastics, and then how it functions, what kind of polymers it's in. And so some of these, so they're those are the 29. They are currently being evaluated, and I'm thinking that within the next few months, I would need to ask Emma Lavoie, who's leading this partnership, exactly what the timeline is, and I could get back to you on that. But it should be really within just a few months where the draft assessments will be ready. But some of these have already been reviewed. Some of the chemicals, we're working on a PINFA pilot have already been assessed, and we've already looked at, say, RDP and BPADP, and so some of them we already know are safer. Some of them may not be, and so that'll be important work. But there are clearly alternatives, and I would be happy to get back to you with the timeline.
Thanks so much.
Again, if there's anyone out there who would like to ask a question or make a comment, you'll need to press *6 on your telephone to unmute your line. I'm hoping that someone will pipe up just so that I know for sure that I successfully unmuted the lines. Even if you don't have a question, can someone who's not a presenter say something?
Hi, this is Yolanda. Why calling
wonderful.
from Georgia?
Thank you, Yolanda.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks for the
This is Lauren. I have a question. What do you all think are the biggest challenges to passing this legislation in Alaska?
Well, this is Samantha, and well, as you saw in the House Labor and Commerce Committee, they just are concerned about, you gave this presentation on alternatives, but it seems like they're really listening to the testimony of people who represent the Burn Injury Committee, and it just seems like, just the burden is on us to make sure that to present, this scientific evidence that there are safer alternatives, and it's a hard task to, to provide all this information, even though, on the health effects, like Arlene Blum said, it's just human data shouldn't be like shouldn't be the deciding factor. And there are, and I brought up new evidence, and it's just different in Alaska when you're trying to go against industry. It's a lot more difficult in a state like Alaska.
Yeah. I heard them saying things like, shouldn't we just wait for the federal government to do this? Why should the state do something ahead of the federal government? And then I think there was some confusion about the fact that these chemicals are not manufactured in the U.S. anymore, to say that that doesn't mean they're not coming in through products, that these chemicals are being manufactured elsewhere, but they're coming in through products, and being really clear. They were asking questions about what would this bill do that, the federal government or the phase-outs are not doing as well. Have you all, is that something that's been asked of you to provide information as well?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it, though. I think my phone started to... I'm sorry, can you repeat the last half of the question?
Oh, sure. Is that, have you, it seems to me that the phase-out of the chemicals in the U.S. doesn't mean they're not manufactured elsewhere. They're manufactured, for example, in Asia, and they're not, the EPA action plans do not preclude the import of products containing PBDEs. They only there's an agreement to not make PBDEs in the U.S., but that doesn't mean you can't import products that contain PBDEs. So it seems like this bill would close that gap. So right now, I felt like there was some confusion there as well.
Yeah,
you thought that the feds would solve this problem for them.
Yeah, there was a lot of misreading on certain publications, and that is something that we're going to re-emphasize, the important gap this bill closes for just products and the importation of products into Alaska, not just from U.S. manufacturers, but, we don't just get products from there. And so I'm glad that you brought that point up, and we are going to include more documents on that for the committee members in their bill packet for later this afternoon. And I think they understood that point a little better with the Senate version. So.
Yeah,
this is Pam. I just had a quick...
Maybe you could help me with the trash, and by then they should be done.
There's quite a bit of background noise, so if you're not asking a question, I think if you press *6 again, you'll mute your line.
Diana, This is Pam. I wanted to add to what Samantha had to say about that, and I think one of the reasons why states are taking the lead in enacting bans on chemicals such as PBDEs, and there are 12 states that have enacted laws to phase out certain PBDEs, and 4 states specifically that have enacted laws to phase out DECA in products. And states are taking the lead. The federal system of chemicals policy is really broken, and I think states have felt the need to protect public health, recognizing that these chemicals such as PBDEs are harmful to the health of people, particularly children. And EPA did cited PBDEs as chemicals of concern, and although they intend to limit new uses of them, this proposal has been stuck in bureaucratic review. So really what we have from EPA is only a voluntary agreement with 3 manufacturers, and it, as Lauren said, it does not pertain to imports of PBDEs, which are in products that we're using in our homes and in our workplaces. So I think it's very important for states to take action, and prudent to take action to protect public health, because we do have very important new evidence about the effects that these chemicals can have on our health, and the evidence that Samantha cited about the effects on children's neurodevelopment is, I think, particularly compelling.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question for either? Yes, go ahead.
In Homer.
Yes.
I was just reading about 5 or 6 states that have passed legislation for something called a benefit corporation, where they're giving, I don't know what kind of credit they're giving corporations who actually have some positive values in their constitution, but legislating some support for that seems like another thing that could help promote this proactive approach to corporations actually looking for ways to do the right thing, and I love that you're giving them a way to do that more easily.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems that I think that was the kind of an epiphany we had a while back, that, you know, corporations do want to do the right thing, but they often need tools. They're not interested in buying toxic chemicals and putting them in their products, and so industry is not a unified front. The chemical manufacturers are not the same as the product manufacturers. They don't have the same motivations.
Right.
I'm not saying that all chemical manufacturers want to make toxic chemicals. I'm just saying that, you know, the product manufacturers have the desire to buy the safest alternatives. They're motivated to do that.
Right. Well, beginning to look at what are their motivations and what tools do they need to do the right thing seems like such a positive approach to get off of testing, you know, and fighting. It's really, I really appreciate what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. But it also can't be done without the bans, because you need those drivers, and I think just the fact that they continue to, you know, that bans continue sort of sets it creates a design direction for people, and they want to get beyond the regulations, because regulations are kind of a pain. So you want to get beyond it, but and have ways to do the right thing, and so you don't even have to deal with regulations. That would be the sort of ideal scenario.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you have to understand what it is that you want to avoid. It can't be, you know, they can't feel like it's arbitrary, or, you know, if they are very clear that PBTs are undesirable, then you can make sure that you're not using PBTs. That sort of thing. So I think the language in the bill that you've got is good, because it does talk about, you know, making a list of PBTs, or even moving not just from listed chemicals to attributes. Is a chemical a PBT, whether it's on a list or not? Those are important questions.
We have about 5 minutes left. If there's anyone who hasn't spoken up yet who would like to ask a question or make a comment. Do we have any final remarks from either of our speakers?
I just hope that if you have the chance that you contact your district representative and senator and let them know that you care about the health effects that these PBD exposures are giving Alaskans, and we're at the receiving end for these toxic chemicals, and this legislation could have multi-generational effects for our children as well. So thank you for listening.
Lauren, would you like to make any final comments?
No, just thank you again for having me, and I hope to be able to meet you all in person if you get to Juneau or I get to Anchorage.
And Pam, did you want to say anything else?
This is Pat Hilgard in Alexandria.
Oh, yes, okay.
Hi, Pat.
Hi there. And I'd just like to ask Lauren what's happening with cleaning products these days, and are they actually out on the safer cleaning products out on the market, and can people in other places be actually looking to buy those now?
Yes, the DFE program has, I believe, over 2,000 products now that they've evaluated, and let me just look at their website. They have something called the Formulator program, and they evaluate cleaning products and other products for inherent hazards. So they have the greenest chemicals, the safest chemicals based on DFE criteria, and I believe they're over 2,000 now. So you can go to their website and look up categories of products, everything from all-purpose cleaners to degreasers and granite and stone cleaners, etc. And then look up those products that carry the DFE logo on them. So and Pat was very helpful in terms of helping to develop these criteria for safer chemicals.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay,
Hi,
thank you, Lauren.
This is Deborah Jorgensen. I would just want to, I've had a chemical injury, and I just wanted to thank all of you very much for trying to make our world safer and all the hard work that you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Diana, this is Pam. Maybe just one closing thought here, and that should compel Alaskans to really care, especially about this issue, is that there was a study done by the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program that showed that women in the Yukon region have the highest levels of PBDEs in their blood serum of any population in the circumpolar Arctic, which again demonstrates that we are on the receiving end. People are exposed to higher levels of these chemicals in the north, not only because of the long-range transport, but because our homes are well insulated and we're in our homes for a greater part of the year. And a preliminary breast milk monitoring study showed that a woman in northern Alaska had the highest level of PBDEs in her breast milk than any women in compared with women in 5 other countries. So I think these studies show that we are receiving higher levels and exposed to higher levels of these chemicals, which to me means that we are even have a greater urgency, and this should compel us to urgent action. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today. And if you have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact ACAT at 907-222-7714 or by email at samantha@akaction.org. And if you found this presentation compelling and would like to share it with your friends, it will be posted, the audio recording will be posted within the next day or two on our website, where you can also find an archive of several years' worth of Pay Alaska calls. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.
And don't forget to testify and write letters to the the House Labor and Commerce Committee members. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.